JD Vance breaks. Jasmine Crockett's trap. Moment, Jasmine's face is ugly. The congressional hearing room buzzed with quiet tension. The air was thick, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unflattering glow over the polished wooden tables and the stacks of neatly arranged papers. Journalists huddled in the back, fingers hovering over keyboards, eyes sharp for the slightest flicker of drama. JD Vance sat at the head of the table, his posture, straight eyes focused. The Vice President of the United States, known for his sharp mind and unyielding principles, wore a calm expression, the kind of calm that spoke of careful preparation. He was a man who had grown up in the Rust Belt, where factories had fallen silent and dreams had been deferred. His gray suit was crisp, his red tie perfectly knotted. In his hands he held a thin stack of documents, his fingers lightly drumming against the paper as he waited for the hearing to begin. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, adjusting the microphone in front of her. She was known as a fierce advocate for social justice, a rising star in her party, and a vocal critic of the administration. Today, her eyes were sharp behind her dark-rimmed glasses, her jaw set, and her mind already buzzing with the arguments she had rehearsed. She had come prepared to make a stand to seize the spotlight and confront Vance head-on. The gavel dropped. The room fell silent. "Let's bring this session to order," the chairman said, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Jasmine was the first to speak. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of controlled anger. "Mr. Vice President, we're here to talk about housing reform, but I can't ignore the reality facing millions of Americans in places like my district. Places where families like the Hernandez family are struggling to keep a roof over their heads." Vance didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed on her, his expression unreadable. "Mario Hernandez," she continued, "is a single father working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He has a 10-year-old son who does his homework by flashlight because the electricity was cut off. His roof leaks every time it rains, and he's on a waiting list for affordable housing that seems to stretch forever. This isn't an isolated story. It's the reality for thousands in my district." Jasmine's words hung in the air, echoing off the walls, and for a moment the room was perfectly still. She leaned back, crossing her arms, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face as she saw a few heads nodding in the gallery. Vance leaned forward, his fingers still lightly tapping the edge of his papers. "I appreciate your passion, Congresswoman," he said, his tone polite but edged with steel. "But passion alone doesn't solve problems. Data does." He picked up one of the papers in front of him, holding it up for effect. "According to the Congressional Budget Office, federal housing programs in your district have received billions in funding over the past decade. Yet homelessness has risen by 22% in the past 5 years. Eviction rates are among the highest in the nation. If money alone were the answer, why are we still failing families like the Hernandezes?" Jasmine's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected Vance to respond so quickly, to counter her emotional appeal with cold, hard numbers. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face, every slight twitch of Vance's eyebrow. "Mr. Vice President," she shot back, her voice rising slightly, "throwing out statistics doesn't capture the real struggle these families face. You can't put a percentage on the fear a parent feels when they can't pay the rent or keep the heat on in the winter." Vance leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression calm, almost amused. "And yet, without those numbers, how do we know if our policies are actually helping? How do we know if billions of dollars are being spent wisely?" Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Vance wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto hers. "This isn't about denying help to the needy. It's about making sure that the help actually reaches them instead of getting lost in bureaucracy and waste." A murmur rippled through the audience. A few journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Vance had turned the focus away from emotions and back to policy, back to the very heart of the issue. Jasmine felt the shift. She adjusted her glasses, her mind racing to recalibrate. She needed to strike back to reclaim the momentum before it slipped completely from her grasp. But Vance wasn't done. He flipped to another page in his folder, his eyes never leaving hers. "Take the case of Carla Thompson," he said, his voice steady. "A 65-year-old former steelworker in Ohio living in a mobile home with a leaky roof and a broken heater. She's been on a waiting list for repairs for 3 years, despite billions in federal aid flowing into her district. Why? Because the money never reaches people like Carla. It gets swallowed up by inefficiency and corruption. The silence in the room deepened. Jasmine's fingers tightened around her microphone. She had come to the hearing ready for a fight, but she hadn't expected Vance to come armed with both data and personal stories. The opening round had ended, but the real battle was just beginning. As the hearing continued, the tension in the room thickened the air, almost crackling with unspoken challenges. Vance leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Crockett, his demeanor that of a seasoned lawyer, ready to dismantle a shaky argument. Crockett, sensing the subtle shift in the atmosphere, straightened her papers, her hand trembling just a bit as she prepared to press her point further. She needed to recover to regain control of the narrative. She cleared her throat, eyes narrowing, as she leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Vance," she began, her tone sharp, "you speak of accountability, yet you ignore the human cost. Numbers don't show the mother who skips meals to keep her child in school or the father working 2 jobs to cover rent." Her voice grew stronger, feeding off the sympathetic nods from her supporters behind her. "You mentioned Carl and his struggles in Middletown, but what about Maria in South Dallas? She's not just a statistic. She's a single mother, 38, balancing 2 part-time jobs, fighting to keep a leaking roof over her son's head." Vance didn't flinch. He adjusted his tie, his expression calm, almost inviting her to continue. He understood the power of patience, the strength in letting your opponent reveal their weaknesses. Crockett, however, mistook his silence for hesitation. "You talk about budgets and efficiency," she pressed on, "but where was that efficiency when families in my district needed help? Why are we still talking about reform when we should be talking about results?" She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "Why are you willing to let people like Maria struggle just to prove a point about government waste?" A few murmurs rippled through the audience, a mix of agreement and anticipation. Crockett had found her footing again, or so it seemed. Vance straightened his eyes, never breaking contact. He allowed a brief, deliberate pause before leaning into his microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice low but firm, "you paint a compelling picture, but you're missing the fundamental point. Emotion without action is just noise." He flipped through the papers in front of him, extracting a highlighted sheet with the ease of a litigator presenting a key piece of evidence. Let's talk about Maria. You mentioned her struggles, but did you know that in the past 5 years, federal funds meant to support housing in your district increased by 15%, yet homelessness and eviction rates have only gone up? The air in the room seemed to tighten. The reporters leaning in pens poised, the clicks of camera shutters soft but relentless. If the system you defend is so effective, why do the numbers tell a different story? Why are families like Maria's still struggling? Despite billions in funding, Crockett's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected him to pivot so quickly to counter her emotional appeals with cold, unflinching data. She glanced down at her notes, but Vance pushed forward, his voice gaining momentum. "I'm not dismissing Maria's struggles," he continued, his tone softening slightly, "but I refuse to accept that the only solution is pouring more money into a broken system. You say I lack compassion, but I say I have the responsibility to demand results, not just spend for the sake of spending." He leaned back, letting his words hang in the air, the echo of his challenge ringing through the room. The audience, sensing a shift, murmured quietly. Crockett's allies exchanged uneasy glances, realizing their champion had been cornered, if only for the moment. But Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in again, her voice sharper, more desperate. "So you're saying the problem is local leadership, that the communities themselves are to blame for this crisis?" Vance's expression hardened, his jaw setting. "I'm saying that if we genuinely care about the people we represent, we should stop throwing money into bureaucratic black holes and start demanding real change." He tapped his stack of papers, each page a quiet testament to his preparation. Because without accountability, every dollar spent is just another broken promise. The room fell into a tense silence, the kind that lingers before a storm. Vance's eyes remained locked on Crockett's, his message clear. He wasn't here for theatrics. He was here to win. JD Vance adjusted his microphone, his eyes still locked on Jasmine Crockett as the room's energy shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but sharp, ready to counter her emotional appeal with hard facts. It was a classic setup, passion versus pragmatism, and Vance had prepared well. "Congresswoman," he began, I appreciate your concern for your community, but passion alone can't solve real-world problems. We need numbers, accountability, and effective policies, not just powerful anecdotes. Vance reached for the stack of documents in front of him, flipping to a highlighted section. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, federal housing programs have received billions in funding, yet homelessness in cities like Dallas has risen by 22% in the last 5 years. Eviction rates remain among the highest in the nation despite substantial federal support. The room fell silent, the cameras capturing every word. Crockett shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence seeming to waver under the weight of Vance's data-driven approach. Vance continued unfazed. These aren't just numbers on a page. These statistics represent real lives, people like Maria you spoke about. But if federal funds alone were the answer, we wouldn't be seeing these kinds of failures. He paused, letting the point sink in. In fact, the programs you support spend only 38% of their budgets directly on helping families. The rest is lost in administrative overhead bureaucracy and wasteful spending. That's not compassion. That's a betrayal of the very people we claim to represent. Crockett's eyes narrowed, but she held her tongue. Vance wasn't just making a political point. He was building a case brick by brick aimed directly at the core of her argument. He leaned in his tone, steady but cutting. And let's talk about accountability. You mentioned families waiting years for housing vouchers. Why are they still waiting despite billions in federal support? Where is that money going? A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Vance glanced down at his papers, flipping to another highlighted line. Just last year, Dallas received over $500 million in federal housing grants. Yet according to the city's own reports, more than 5,000 families are still on waiting lists for affordable housing. He paused, letting the room absorb the impact. This isn't just a funding problem, it's a leadership problem. The tension in the room thickened. Crockett's jaw tightened. She had come prepared to talk about community, to tell the stories of struggle and perseverance. But Vance was dragging the debate into the numbers, cold, hard, unfeeling numbers that left little room for emotional rebuttal. Congresswoman Vance continued his tone, almost sympathetic. If we want to help families like Maria's, we need more than emotional appeals. We need oversight, transparency, and a willingness to admit when programs aren't working. Crockett straightened in her chair, clearly preparing a counterattack. But Vance wasn't finished. I've seen what happens when communities are forgotten, he said, his voice dropping slightly. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. I know what it's like to struggle to see families torn apart by bad policy and broken promises. But unlike you, I don't believe that writing a blank check from Washington solves these problems. He leaned back slightly, his eyes still fixed on Crockett. Real change comes from local solutions, from empowering cities and states to manage their own challenges without layers of federal red tape. It comes from trusting the people closest to the problems, not just throwing money at them and hoping it sticks. Crockett's face was tense now, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She opened her mouth to speak, but Vance held up a hand, cutting her off. If you want to fix these problems, let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about cutting waste, reducing overhead, and making sure every dollar actually reaches the people who need it. He leaned forward again, his tone dropping to a near whisper. Or are you more interested in grandstanding than real solutions? The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that only follows a devastating blow. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Crockett's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Vance sat back, his expression calm, his posture relaxed as if he had merely stated the obvious. But the impact was clear. He had taken the air out of Crockett's arguments, reducing her passionate plea to a series of unsubstantiated claims and emotional outbursts. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. As the hearing resumed, the room buzzed with a new energy. JD Vance, fresh off a strategic advantage from his earlier exchange with Jasmine Crockett, remained composed. His documents were neatly arranged, his demeanor steady. Across the table, Crockett adjusted her microphone, a hint of fire still in her eyes, but her confidence had taken a hit. The stakes were clear, and both sides knew that every word would be scrutinized. Vance leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Congresswoman Crockett, I respect the stories you shared, but stories alone won't fix the broken housing system. Data drives decisions, not just emotion. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. For instance, The federal housing programs you champion have spent billions over the past decade, yet homelessness in cities like Dallas has surged by 22% in the last 5 years. That's not a success story. That's a crisis. Crockett's eyes narrowed. She had expected him to rely on spreadsheets and statistics, but the directness of his tone caught her off guard. She glanced at her notes, searching for a counterpunch, but Vance pressed on. I understand the pain of those struggling. Vance continued, his tone dropping to a more personal register. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mother worked multiple jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for broken systems to fix themselves. That's why I believe in reform that puts power back into local hands, people who know their communities, who care about their neighbors. Crockett, regaining her footing, leaned in. And yet, Mr. Vance, she shot back, her voice sharp, your record shows a history of opposing bills that could have directly helped those same struggling families. You talk about local control, but when you vote against funding, that could replace those leaking roofs you mentioned. What message does that send? The audience, a mix of staffers, journalists, and political aides, leaned in. The air crackled with anticipation. Vance didn't flinch. It sends the message, he replied, that I refuse to support blank checks without accountability. I want every dollar to reach families like the ones you described, not vanish into bureaucratic black holes. Crockett's eyes flashed. That's a convenient excuse, Mr. Vance, but when you reject funding, you're rejecting the people who need it most. You're turning your back on families like Maria's. Vance leaned back slightly, his fingers steepling. Maria's struggles are real, and I respect your passion. But passion without precision can be dangerous. We can't keep pouring money into failing systems and expect different results. Real change means breaking the cycle, not reinforcing it. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the exchange settling over the hearing like a thick fog. Crockett, feeling the momentum slipping, leaned forward, her voice rising. You can talk about accountability all you want, but at the end of the day, you're still voting to cut resources for the most vulnerable. You're still saying no when people like Maria are asking for help. Vance smiled slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. And you're still defending a system that has failed them for decades, he replied. If you truly want to help Maria, we should be talking about reform, not just more funding. We need a system that works, not just one that spends. A murmur rippled through the room. Journalists scribbled notes, aides whispered, and the cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion. The battle lines were clearer than ever, compassion versus accountability, heart versus head, and neither side showed signs of backing down. As the chair called for a brief recess, both Vance and Crockett leaned back in their seats, the tension between them thick enough to cut. They had each made their points, but the battle for public opinion had only just begun. The hearing reconvened with a different energy. The initial skirmishes had revealed both strengths and weaknesses, but now the stakes felt higher. The audience sensed it. The journalists leaned in, and even the aides shuffled a bit closer, anticipating the next exchange. JD Vance, sensing the momentum shifting in his favor, opened his folder. He carefully selected a page, his expression calm but eyes sharp. Congresswoman Crockett. He began, his tone almost cordial. You mentioned Maria, the struggling single mother, as a symbol of the broken system. I understand the power of stories. They humanize the numbers, but they don't replace facts, and the facts are clear. He placed the paper down, his hands resting lightly on the desk. According to the Congressional Budget Office, over 60% of federal housing funds never reach the people who need them most. They get swallowed by administrative costs, mismanagement, and waste. If we're truly committed to helping people like Maria, we need to address that, not just keep writing blank checks. Crockett's jaw tightened. She had prepared for another round of emotional sparring, but Vance had shifted to cold, hard data. She straightened, gripping the edges of her notes. You talk about waste, but those are funds that keep roofs over people's heads. You can't just write them off because of a few inefficiencies. Vance leaned in, his tone unyielding. A few inefficiencies, Congresswoman. The Department of Housing and Urban Development itself admits that billions are lost to fraud, poorly executed contracts, and delayed projects. That's not a minor flaw. That's a broken system. Crockett hesitated, realizing she needed to regain control. She leaned forward, her voice rising. You want to talk about inefficiency. How about the corporate tax cuts you supported that drained public funds needed for these programs? You can't have it both ways, Mr. Vance, demanding efficiency while stripping away the resources that make it possible. The room felt the heat rising. Staffers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others furrowing their brows. Vance didn't miss a beat. I support tax cuts because they fuel economic growth, which leads to jobs, which means fewer people relying on federal aid. That's not neglecting the poor, that's empowering them. Crockett's eyes flashed. She wasn't going to let him control the narrative. And yet, while you preach about economic growth, families are still falling through the cracks. That growth you talk about hasn't reached the Mariahs of the world, has it? They're still struggling to pay rent, still waiting for a system that cares about them. Vance straightened his eyes, locking with hers. Which is exactly why reform is necessary. If we keep funneling money into the same failing programs, we'll keep getting the same failing results. It's not about abandoning people, it's about building a system that actually works for them. The tension in the room thickened. Crockett felt the pressure, but she also felt the crowd's energy, the quiet nods from those who shared her frustration. She took a deep breath, choosing her next words carefully. Mr. Vance, you say you care about reform, but every vote you cast says otherwise. You can't claim to stand for the people while consistently siding with policies that leave them behind. Vance leaned back, crossing his arms slowly, a small, knowing smile creeping onto his face. And you can't claim to be their champion while defending a broken system that keeps them trapped. The room fell into a charged silence. Both sides had landed their punches, and the crowd sensed that this was no longer just a debate. It was a defining moment. As the chair signaled the next round of testimony, Vance closed his folder with a quiet snap, leaning back with the confidence of a man who felt the tide turning in his favor. Crockett, meanwhile, forced herself to sit up straighter, her mind racing for a way to regain the upper hand. The battle was far from over, but the cracks in her armor were beginning to show. As the hearing moved into its final stretch, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted dramatically. The initial fire of rhetoric had given way to a colder, sharper exchange where every word felt weighted, every pause a potential pivot. The room, once buzzing with scattered whispers, now held a more focused silence, as if the stakes had become clear to everyone present. JD Vance, sensing the endgame, leaned forward, his fingers steepled. He looked directly at Congresswoman Crockett, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. Congresswoman, you've spoken passionately about the people of Dallas, about families like Maria's struggling to make ends meet. I respect that. But passion without results is just noise. He reached for a stack of papers, carefully selecting a single highlighted page. Here's a report from the Government Accountability Office, he said, holding it up for emphasis. It shows that less than 40% of the housing funds you champion actually reach those they're meant to help. The rest is lost in bureaucratic overhead, wasted on poorly managed projects, or simply disappears into administrative black holes. Crockett leaned in, eyes narrowing. So your solution is to cut funding even further to make it harder for families like Maria's to get help. Vance shook his head, his tone sharp but controlled. No, my solution is to reform these programs so they actually work, to ensure that every dollar reaches those who need it most rather than lining the pockets of contractors and bureaucrats. Crockett's lips tightened. She was used to countering sound bites, not surgical strikes like this. She shuffled through her notes, looking for a foothold. You talk about reform, but what you really mean is stripping these programs down to the bone, leaving families in the cold. Vance didn't hesitate. That's not true, and you know it. I'm talking about accountability, about cutting waste and focusing resources where they matter most. It's about giving people a path out of poverty, not just trapping them in it with endless, inefficient spending. The room grew tense. Even the reporters had stopped typing, their eyes locked on the two figures at the center of the storm. Vance's steady tone contrasted sharply with Crockett's rising pitch, creating a sense of imbalance, a shift in the room's emotional weight. Crockett, sensing this, forced herself to smile, but it came off strained. And while you focus on your spreadsheets and charts, real people are still suffering. You talk about efficiency, but what about empathy? Vance leaned back, crossing his arms. Empathy without action is just sentiment. It's not enough to care. You have to deliver results. That's what real leadership looks like. For a moment, the two locked eyes, a silent clash of wills that seemed to freeze the air in the room. Then the chair cleared his throat, breaking the tension. We'll now take closing statements. Crockett, sensing her last opportunity, leaned into the microphone. I won't stand by while my community is left behind. I won't let their voices be drowned out by spreadsheets and budget cuts. I stand for people, not percentages. Vance responded calmly, his tone almost weary. And I stand for a system that actually works, that actually helps, not one that traps people in poverty generation after generation. As the gavel came down signaling the end of the hearing, the room erupted into murmurs. Reporters scrambled for the exits, eager to file their stories. Crockett gathered her notes with a clenched jaw, her gaze fixed on the far wall as if refusing to acknowledge her opponent. Vance, on the other hand, slipped his papers into his briefcase with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who knows he has the upper hand. He paused at the door, glancing back at the now empty witness stand, his expression unreadable. Outside, the camera lights flared as reporters clustered around the exit. But Vance simply adjusted his tie, offered a brief nod to his staff, and stepped into the hallway, disappearing into the noise and chaos of Capitol Hill. Behind him, the echoes of the hearing still lingered, a testament to a battle that had become about much more than housing policy. The fallout from the hearing would ripple out for weeks as headlines dissected every moment, every exchange, every jab and counter-jab. But for Vance, this was just another step in a much larger game, one where the stakes were not just political points, but the very shape of the American future.